Hi there, Lorian.
Hi, Andrew. Great to have you. Thank you for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Good to be here.
Okay. And can you hear me okay?
Like you're right here in the room.
Wonderful. Okay. So,
How about my sound?
as we were talking about earlier today, I was just explaining to the audience that Project Pegasus is a different program than the CIA Mars Jump Room program. Is
Absolutely.
that correct?
Yeah, they were two different programs. The Project Pegasus was the U.S. time-space program under DARPA at the time of the emergence of time travel technology. So it had a number of devices that enabled time travel per se, physical bodily time travel, as well as technical remote viewing of non-local event scenarios, what we would call timelines or events going on in what we call the past and future. The CIA's Jump Room program emerged about 10 years later, and it was focused on what we might call a teleporter, basically this rather enigmatic device called a jump room that we're not really clear regarding the origin of. I have the provenance of the devices that emerged by 1970, but the origin of the jump room is a little bit more mysterious. There are some indications it might have been lent to the U.S. government by the gray extraterrestrials. There seems to be a Howard Hughes connection, and we can explore that tonight.
Oh, I'd love to. Yes. Okay.
So there were two different programs. One was essentially a classified defense-related research and development program under DARPA, where they were actively developing time travel technologies and training the next cadre of American chrononauts on the devices when they were children, so that we would be as accustomed to going from our alpha timeline to alternate timelines in the way, for example, you can train a child to be comfortable scuba diving, going from the terrestrial to the aquatic environment and back, because they were having difficulty training adult chrononauts because of the sort of the deracinating effects of leaving the primary timeline that you've known since childhood, going to an alternate timeline in the past or future, and then coming back and establishing your normal existence. The Jump Room program was highly specialized, and it was really focused on exploring a terrestrial environment that, when we were trained, was presumed to be Mars. But there's some question now and a bit of a disagreement among the chrononauts who were in the CIA's Jump Room program as to whether we were accessing the terrestrial domain that we know of as Mars or some synthetic quantum environment that had been designed by a higher intelligence to create the effect of visiting Mars. And so that's another theme that we could explore tonight.
I would love to, because Bernie Mendez was explaining to my audience 2 weeks ago about how he went into the Ford's Theater where Lincoln was assassinated and broke off a piece of the guardrail and or the railing that is in front of the box where Lincoln was shot. And in that universe, it was made out of plastic. And also to the effect that when he walked out of the building itself, this construct, that if he took 50 paces to the right or left or behind or in front, it was all blackness, and he could walk into the blackness, but there was nothing there.
Right.
So
even back when I was serving in Project Pegasus in the early 70s, DARPA was using a lot of Civil War locations, both with the different forms of teleportation that they had developed, and also the technical remote viewing and synthetic holographic experience of past locations, because the Civil War was something that for 100 years prior to the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense technical community, literally hundreds and hundreds of American historians had described specific events to the last detail.
Right.
I mean, we know what kind of mustache Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain had when he prevailed at Little Round Top during the Battle of Gettysburg. We know what state he was in, et cetera. So they were using specific Civil War event scenarios.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Freedom Perspective on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. Oops, I said that wrong. It's freedomslips.com. And I just want to thank everybody for listening in. You know, we are a listener-supported station, and we really need your help. So anytime you've got 5, 10, 15, 20 bucks, or you're thinking about heading down to Starbucks, instead, hit that donate button and keep us on the air, because we could really use the support. And I thank you so much for listening to Revolution Radio. And with no further ado, I'm going to bring Andrew back on. And are you there, Andrew?
Hi there, Lauren. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes. Now I can hear you wonderfully. We were just talking about how the DARPA scientists were sending people back to the Revolutionary War era. And
Actually,
you were talking...
Yeah, to the Civil War.
The Civil War, I'm sorry. The Revolutionary War would be quite interesting too, but yes, Civil War. And you can go on about that. You were talking about the mustache on one of the generals, I believe.
No, actually, just to clarify, they were sending us to different historical periods, and I had one episode where I was sent to the Revolutionary War, but we were discussing the fact that they were isolating specific Civil War events. For example, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater. And in the summer of 1971, from the chronovisor that was located on the symphony orchestra-sized stage that is it's still there. It's in the gymnasium inside the Cerrillos Community Center compound, which is right outside of Cerrillos, New Mexico, outside of Santa Fe, New Mexico. And they had a fairly large chronovisor array there, which was a device that created essentially a moving block of kind of a holographic effect. And when we would stand on the stage, when the device was turned on, we would be immediately repositioned in time-space and literally be inhabiting that event. And during the 5 or 6 times that DARPA sent me to the night literally to Ford's Theater on the night that President Lincoln was assassinated, which was April 14th of 1865. When I described my experiences there, what had happened is each time they sent me to that same event, it changed a little bit. Like one time I saw President and Mrs. Lincoln walking through the lobby of Ford's Theater, but on the other jumps I didn't. So in midsummer of 1971, especially in light of the risk to the children involved, DARPA decided to shut down time travel to the past. And at that time, the second whistleblower to come forward on the Mars program, Bernard Mendez, had been serving essentially as an investigator for President Nixon. He was essentially President Nixon's go-to guy on extraterrestrials. And Bernie is really a critical whistleblower in the truth movement because he was interfacing with extraterrestrials, and he was also investigating the activities of the U.S. government itself in its initial forays in the time-space exploration activities that I got caught up in during childhood under Project Pegasus, and then later, 10 years later in the early 80s, when the CIA launched its Mars Jump Room program. And what Bernie was describing relative to the Lincoln assassination site is that when he went there, he found essentially a fabricated environment.
Exactly.
And so, the question we're exploring now is, we know that I was engaged in some forms of time travel because the only way that they could facilitate my activity on a project level in New Mexico and not have me go missing from the perspective of my mother, my siblings, my teacher, my classmates, was we were teleporting from a device up at the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Woodridge, New Jersey. So I know I was time traveling during those years because there were offsets of time. For example, we would jump to New Mexico. It would, day would turn into dusk. And then when we jump back to New Jersey through the teleporter at the Sandia National Labs, it might be 11 a.m. on the day that we had left. So we were physically being moved around in time-space, but Bernie's position is that some of these event scenarios that we were visiting in the past, for example, were what I have termed synthetic quantum environments. They were sort of little dioramas in time-space in which a past event had been stored. And that's consistent with conventional physics, because we know, and certainly Enrico Fermi's position on time travel, because we know that the second law of thermodynamics seems to be in place in the universe, which is that the matter and energy in the universe seeks maximum randomness. This is the so-called entropy principle. So if the entropy principle is a universal law of physics, that means that the past only exists when it's either remembered or recorded. It doesn't exist as a place you can visit. And nonetheless, the time travelers that I was trained with, and then the later Mars explorers, we were literally going to places. And so what Bernie's suggesting is that at least in regards to the past event scenarios, which were so ornate and so clearly the time of Lincoln. I mean, I had literally been dressed up as a society kid to talk my way past the ticket table in front of the lobby of Ford's Theater on the night that President Lincoln got shot.
Right.
He's suggesting that we could have visited these quote-unquote past events because a higher intelligence, namely the gray, some species of gray extraterrestrial, had stored a simulation of that event in a pocket of time-space, essentially suspending the entropy principle, storing it in space in the same way that we would film a wedding and store it on a DVD.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So this kind of holodeck principle is now something that we're exploring. But I have to just say in prescript before we have a more elaborate discussion of that, I know that time travel emerged during that time because we were being moved between positions in time space simply by teleporting back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's a very.
I just want to interject something here. When you say that the ETs or the Greys are keeping like a database of our past, is how I'm seeing it. When you were actually there in is it Ford's or Forbes? I can never remember. I think Ford's. Yeah. When you were there and you saw President Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln walk by you, how real did they look? Did they look like absolute solid people, or were they a little fuzzy around the edges light-wise? Was there something different about them that you noticed that you don't see here in actual physical 3D?
That's a fascinating question because I can really describe what it was like to be chronovized, okay, a new version.
Okay, that's wonderful because I think the audience would be very interested in the answer to this, and we'll get to the why I'm asking after you explain that to us, if it's okay.
Right, so I was 9 years old. I would turn 10 in September of 71, so this is summer of 71. I'm in this Depression-era community center with a huge basketball court and a huge stage in the front. And they've got this setup that produces a block of moving cinema. Okay, so they turn that block of moving cinema on around me. I'm immersed in it. And I suddenly find myself in the mud in front of Ford's Theater. But for those who have glasses or contacts, it was almost as if the scene had to tune in for about 15 or 30 seconds, sort of like when you put contact lenses on. And you get kind of a misty effect, and then your eyes adjust, and the contact lens is occlude to your eyeballs, and suddenly everything's crystal clear. So I then would talk my way past the ticket desk in the front of the theater, and and this really goes to whether or not it was whether it was the Lincoln assassination on our timeline, a real Lincoln assassination on an adjacent timeline, which is my theory, or whether really what was going on is what Bernard Mendez has described, and that is a kind of a simulation of Lincoln's assassination in a kind of an interactive holographic reality that was artificial and that had been created by a higher intelligence. So in answer to your question, when I looked across the lobby and I saw, in fact, Mrs. Lincoln walking in front of the president, Mrs. Lincoln in 1865, by my impression as, a 9-year-old schoolboy from New Jersey, was rather overweight. She was rather chubby. And Mr. Lincoln was walking behind her, and he was more stoop-shouldered and more emaciated than I think I would have scripted based on every image I had seen of Abraham Lincoln. Obviously, every still photograph I had seen at that point of President Lincoln as an American, schoolboy of that era. There was certainly no movie or TV, moving images of President Lincoln because those technologies hadn't emerged yet.
Right.
In our civilization. But what's interesting is as I looked across maybe 40 feet across the lobby and saw them enter with Mrs. Lincoln walking in front of President Lincoln, is he looked quite elderly and leaning, almost listing forward with the stoop nature of his spine at that point.
Okay.
very emaciated, like somebody who was already experiencing the physical deterioration from a terminal illness like cancer. And so
That's
the
interesting.
subtlety of this. If I had just been projecting what I knew about Lincoln in a kind of just a merely interior sort of psychic viewing of him, a remote viewing of him, or alternatively, whether the reality I was being sent to was scripted by the Greys, how is it that Mr. Lincoln looked so emaciated and so elderly to me? That, in fact, was the condition that he was in by the time of his death. In fact, one theory is that he was dying of cancer at the time of his assassination. So they were walking along, and they were crystal clear, but he didn't look 56 years old. He looked about 80 years old in the last stages of cancer, and he was very stoop-shouldered and very gaunt, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And
you did know that he was not well at the end of the war. And he had been, he'd been stressed to the point where I'm surprised he wasn't dead yet. Just from the stress alone, So what you're saying makes total sense. Was he still very tall though, and her very short?
She was diminutive and rather full-figured, and more than let's say I ordinarily would have seen in that era, growing up in New Jersey before the introduction of high fructose corn syrup in the American food supply, beginning around 1980. This is the summer of 1971. So she was certainly more overweight than my mother, my school teachers, women in the neighborhood. Now we're used to everybody being sort of a member of the portly majority, as my friend Greg Kreitzer, the author of Fatland, coined to express the fact that now the majority of adult Americans are overweight. But if we think back at that time, if we look back at our high school yearbooks, most of our instructors even still had a handle on their weight. Okay, so she was more overweight than I would have perceived as an American school child, and he was showing signs of a terminal illness that at that time I didn't have access to that information as a New Jersey school child, circa 1971. I just learned several years ago that historians now believe that President Lincoln may have been in the final, or at least had already begun to begin becoming emaciated from a terminal illness of some kind. So I saw President Lincoln who was essentially almost a walking skeleton, and he was listing over. He had substantial curvature of his upper body, so that he didn't look like that magnificent 6'4" Abraham Lincoln that we see in his photographs from even several years earlier.
Sure.
Time of election in 1860. He was very, very elderly looking and very emaciated and stoop-shouldered. And I think that goes to the reality of what we were visiting. Okay,
and to go further with my question, though, I'm wondering if there's anything different. Did they look like they were, this is going to sound funny, but did their skin look sweaty and doughy? Did they have any glow of light coming off of them? Was there anything to suggest they might be an energetic field and a holographic image instead of a real person, solid blood and mass in 3D?
To me, as a 9-year-old, as a 9-year-old New Jersey school child, a bright child, but by no means a genius, I believed that I was being sent to a place where the people were real, and there was everything ordinary about the pallor of their skin and the mechanics of their movement and so forth. But I will say this, and that is, in support of Bernie's premise that it was some kind of Westworld-like synthetic environment that at least sometimes we were accessing with the chronovisors, when he contacted me, and I remembered who he was from the Jump Room program, and we began consulting for hours and hours over Skype about what, having worked together in the early 1980s, and he described some of the post-hoc missions that he went on where he tried to determine what the children in Project Pegasus had visited and so forth. I had one chronovisor-prompted visit to that same target where I found myself in a Ford's Theater that was sort of under construction like a stage play, and there were literally parts of animatronic parts of human beings laying on workbenches and so forth. So,
that's fascinating.
Yeah. And also Bernie made a comment about how, as an investigator, by interviewing, individuals like me who went there as children and so forth, people would describe things where they would go past, let's say, a hallway, like an adjacent hallway, and they would see that a wall wasn't a true wall, but it was set up just as a facade, like you would during a stage play. I had one encounter with some part of Ford's Theater in which that was the case, where I was kind of mystified that it didn't really hold together solidly. So I think we have to be open-minded to the possibility that this really solves the paradox of how we could have been visiting the past if, in fact, the entropy principle was still in place. And that is to say, we were visiting a simulation of the past rather than the actual past that can be ontologically visited.
Right, right.
But nonetheless,
interesting.
In short distances in the present, we proved that we were time traveling via teleportation back and forth across the country. So two different processes may have been involved.
Now that's fascinating because I don't think anybody that's listened to you or Alfred or anybody else that's involved with the jump rooms has heard this side of the story yet. So thank you for breaking that on my show today. I really appreciate it. Just to dig into it a little further, when you say that you guys were in the jump room and you were actually traveling in time, you're talking about going to the other state, and it would be 11 o'clock in the morning when you went back, but the day had already passed where you were. Was that the exact time you left New Jersey?
No,
then you were
That wasn't
Go ahead.
possible. By the way, that wasn't the jump room. The jump room emerged 10 years later when we were going to Mars. What I was
okay.
jumping
I'm
through
sorry.
Tesla it's confusing because a lot of different devices were involved. In fact, I'm trying to resist just always talking about one device because I'm trying to share with the public the fact that even by 1970 we had numerous, or at least multiple, time travel devices already developed, and they were training a cadre of American school children in time travel of different types. So what I was describing was, for example, when we would be bussed up to the old Curtis Wright facility in Woodridge, New Jersey, from my elementary school in Morris Plains, New Jersey, where I live, we were jumping through two parenthesis-shaped objects that tuned in a field of what Tesla called radiant energy. And we were entering a vortal tunnel in time-space and then just popping into view in New Mexico. So that was a basic shop floor teleportation of that era. We were literally going through, as Jack Pruitt described us when he was training us on that device at Curtis Wright, we were going through an interstitial chasm in the fabric of time-space. The jump room by 1980 was a different technology where essentially we would enter an elevator that would morph, and when the door of the elevator opened, we were on the surface of Mars. So that's another major point I'm making, is that during the 1970s, the U.S. time-space capability went from amazing to phenomenal.
Whoa.
And
that you're just blowing my mind, Andrew. I got to tell you, I'm sitting here just writing notes down because I don't even know where to go with this. So, which would you like to talk about first? The younger age where you were going through the parentheses type Stargate, or would you like to talk about the jump room next?
Well, let's focus on the jump room, because I'm going to be presenting on the CIA's Mars jump room program, 1980 to 1984, as a speaker at the UFOCon 2012 on September 15th.
And I'm so happy you're going to be there. I'm so excited. I just can't wait till we see each other. It'll be like old homecoming day.
Yeah, we're going to experience what I call, proto-affiliation, which is where you meet somebody you already know. You meet somebody for the first time that you already know from Facebook or
Yes, which is becoming a whole virtual world out there. We're kind of time traveling in a different dimension here with our computers. So, that's another whole ball of wax to go into.
Yeah. So we'll have the odd experience of meeting each other for the first time and knowing each other from Facebook and Skype. Yes, I'm going to be presenting on that. It's Saturday before dinner. The conference, of course, is September 15th through 16th. And I'm going to take it through our training in the summer of 1980, through the different experiences that I had between 1981 and 84. When I was a student at UCLA, I was studying history during the day division, and I was dropped into a night school in strategic intelligence under the Naval Postgraduate School in the evenings. So I was getting like 3 or 4 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night from, let's say, fall of 81 to certainly to the spring of 83. My last year in school was a little bit less pressure than that. But from summer of 1981 to spring summer of 1984, I did about 20 jumps to what we had been trained was, and that we all thought was Mars, via a jump room that was located at 999 North Sepulveda Boulevard in El Segundo, California. And that's conspicuous because at that time, that building right there at the corner of Sepulveda and Imperial Avenue West, right south of the Los Angeles International Airport, was owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft. Now, we know Hughes, the founder of Hughes Aircraft and of Hughes Summa Corporation, I guess as it was by then, was in liaison with at least one extraterrestrial species because one of my law clients here in Vancouver, Washington, was a private secretary to Howard Robart Hughes at the main office in El Segundo. And one day, she's a very believable woman in her 80s, she said one day Mr. Hughes came to her at her desk, literally outside his office, and said, Rose, 2 men are going to be coming to your desk today. They're from outer space. I want you to give them these parts. And he had some aerospace parts wrapped in kind of protective packaging. And she said, yes, Mr. Hughes. And she said that 2 gentlemen appeared at her desk who looked like ordinary humans, but they were a little bit more crude-looking than ordinary Caucasian men, although they were, Caucasian apparently, and they were apparently human. And she said their mannerisms were also a little bit more formal and sort of awkward. And I believe that what she had an encounter with are one of the 3 typologies of Martian humanoids that are essentially our genetic cousins on the planet Mars from the time before the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when we placed colonists on Mars. And that population has been breeding amongst itself for, 11,500 years. Mm-hmm. In a population that now numbers about a million, primarily living underground. So at this point, they're still Homo sapiens, but they're sort of a subspecies of our species. They're kind of crude-looking. They have sort of a depleted gene pool. They're very pale because they live primarily underground, and most of them have lost most of their hair.
Yes.
So this establishes that Howard Hughes was in extraterrestrial liaison, but they weren't gray ETs that suddenly strode to her desk at the Hughes headquarters in El Segundo. They were human-looking. Okay.
And I just want to interject something here. I have heard so many stories about screen memories for people, so we do need to take it with a grain of salt that neither you nor I were there to know this, but who's to say whether they weren't actually an E.T. Gray with a screen memory given to her of some people in a black suit, And I'm just throwing that in as interjection, so it doesn't,
Right. Well, if the assuming arguendo that the memory is as valid as any ordinary memory,
correct,
and that Mr. Hughes wasn't playing a practical joke on her, et cetera, it's consistent with what was going on during that period in the aerospace community, because my late father and I, my dad worked for a number of leading aerospace companies beginning shortly after the July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C., by 9 lenticular craft clocked at traveling at 7,000 miles per hour at Langley Air Force Base. The first project placed on was the ramjet engine project at Curtiss-Wright, where he helped design the alloy that the ramjet would be made of so it wouldn't melt from friction from air molecules in our atmosphere or from particles of space dust in outer space. So my dad worked for a number of top aerospace companies. By the time of the years running up to the lunar landing, I remember as a first grader, he showed me the schematics for the lunar landing when he was at Parsons by that point, 1967. And he was going to work on the instrumentation for the lunar module, but it went to Grumman. And he was disappointed he wanted to work on that project. But he ended up basically going from the ramjet project, and during that 20-year period, by the late 60s, he was working on teleportation and was essentially the point man between the Ralph M. Parsons Company of Pasadena, California, and the CIA on the theory and practice of teleportation.
Wow. And, with that, and we're going to be coming up on a break here any second now, I think we should hold off on that and go into, if it's okay with you, a little bit more about the Howard Hughes connection. If you know any more about it, if there's more information, that would be wonderful to talk about. And then we'll go on. Thank you for being with us today on the Fenton Perspective on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I really appreciate you all tuning in, and I just want to remind you one more time today that we are a listener-supported station, so with your help, you'll keep us on the air. So thank you for that, and I do applaud you all for listening to Revolution Radio because it is really a very special place to be, and I call it my home. So with no further ado, here's Andrew. Andrew, where were we?
Well, I was just describing the fact that my father and I had an encounter with 3 Martian astronauts who looked essentially human, like modern Earthlings, a little bit more homely than the average Caucasian male walking down the street, because that Martian typology, I've learned since 2008 from the CIA, only numbers about 1 million individuals living primarily underground on Mars. Now, the fact that Howard Hughes was an extraterrestrial liaison in the 70s, that we know through one of my law clients, is very conspicuous as a data point because it was in a Hughes aircraft building, not the main headquarters for Hughes, but in another building owned and operated by Hughes Aircraft in El Segundo, California, the very city where the Hughes Aircraft headquarters was then and is now, where the West Coast jump room was located. Right across the El Segundo city line from Los Angeles. And the other jump room, referred to as the East Coast jump room, was in New York City. It's also conspicuous, I think, that I was instructed by the CIA to transfer to Columbia in the fall of 1981, as was one of my same-age peers, who now is the 44th President of the United States, who was one of the participants in the jump room, a young man named Barry Soetoro, who a few years later would go on to change his name to Barack Obama. So I presumably would have been jumping from the East Coast jump room if I had taken the instruction of Courtney M. Hunt of the CIA to transfer from UCLA to Columbia. So I think essentially the resolution of the Obama, the mystery of what President Obama was doing in the early 80s when he was supposed to have been attending school at Columbia, somehow must relate to his involvement in this program, because it was certainly taxing me to be, studying history during the day division, strategic intelligence under the Naval Postgraduate School at UCLA at night, writing for the Daily Bruin, and then periodically driving over to El Segundo and jumping to Mars. So the president was very busy during those years, just as I was, and that I think probably explains why none of his contemporaries at Columbia, then studying political science, even those in his degree program, remember him being on campus.
Right. I get that. Andrew, if it's okay with you, we have a caller, 310, that has come on the line, and I'm sure you have an important question for Andrew today. Hello, 310.
Oh yeah. I just turned on to see what you guys are talking about, and nothing surprises me with the CIA and the NSA and what other agency they have. Just it's endless, isn't it?
Yes.
Go
ahead, Andrew.
Well, we're certainly at this point. I mean, think of the time scale I'm talking about here. I first teleported for the United States government sometime between my birthday in September of 1967 and 68, because when my father and I met with Harold Agnew at the Los Alamos National Labs, he asked my father my age, and we both said 6. So that establishes that teleportation, physical teleportation of human beings without injury across the country in several seconds, it probably was occurring instantaneously, but it seemed like several seconds because of time dilation, was fully functional in the U.S. defense technical community by 1967-68, and we were using one of the time travel technologies that emerged during that era to reach Mars by no later than the summer of 1981. And if we're to use Michael Relf's experience, as possibly as early as 1976. So when people talk about a breakaway civilization, it's clearly a possibility, because look, 20 years is a human generation, and we're talking about a 40-year cover-up. We're talking about the cover-up of time travel technologies that were achieved by the grandparents of most living Americans. And I think that's very serious. I think that has profound implications for our polity. I mean, if we don't declassify these technologies, we're going to have a breakaway civilization because the technologies have been held within the cult of intelligence, within this priesthood of time travel scientists, engineers working for major defense contractors, and their trainees. And I've chosen to speak out. I see the president has chosen to play the insider game, but ultimately I think the truth is going to win out, and we'll be able to somehow integrate the development of these technologies into our common culture. If we don't, I really don't think we're going to be able to stay on a positive timeline, because ultimately a conspiracy, a cult, a breakaway civilization in control of these technologies will begin to use them to exploit all of those who are outsiders.
Yes, exactly. Hey, caller on 310, do you have a question for Andrew?
Andrew, if they could teleport people, is it possible that they could teleport, like, get rid of all the nuclear power plants? Can we teleport them out to Mars or somewhere?
No, I mean, one of the constraints of Tesla teleportation is that any metal that has magnetic properties can't be teleported because of the electrostatic discharge that occurs in the Vortal tunnel during when the object is undergoing teleportation. But this idea of teleporting technology is sound. In fact, in my call for making teleportation public, I think what we should first do is introduce it to get all those 16-wheelers off our highways. In other words, we should start first teleporting non-magnetic metals and things like foodstuffs, because then that will reduce all of the physical danger, all of the air pollution, all of the stress of commuters on our highways competing with those vehicles that transport the things that allow life to go on, basically supplies, goods. And then use and then use that to establish the system, and then we would begin introducing civilian transport at the airport utilizing that system. But I think if we could demonstrate it shipping goods, then people would realize, well, wait, if this avocado got to me in the state of Maine from California, then maybe I can jump to California from the state of Maine through a teleporter, and that'll be a way to introduce teleportation publicly by first demonstrating it as being safe to teleport our food supply around the country and the world, to use it for famine relief, for example, to get food precisely where it's needed around the world.
And that brings up an amazing thing I want to go into. I want to thank our caller on 310 for calling in, and we're going to go on to the next part of this, which is I wanted to bring up, Andrew, if people are teleporting their food and what have you, and we can, in essence, what you're saying is we can solve all the world's hunger problems. There's a lot of things we can fix with this teleportation device. Now, are you sure the cabal that runs our country and the evil entities that take over on this planet all the time are going to allow that? Because I would love to see the technology taken out there and given to the people, but I just, being the glass is half empty in this conversation, not sure that they're going to let it out. So how do you feel about that? Do you think they're ever going to do that?
I'm often reminded that there are powerful interests who would oppose my initiative to achieve global public teleportation by 2020, and I'm going to be seeking presidency in 2016 to try to bring that about. I don't want to introduce it on this show, Lorian, but there is a trump card that an elected president of the United States can play to literally force the powers that be to make this transition. And I don't want to say
that's great. Yeah. Don't bring it up now. That's something to save for another day, but and another time actually. But no, that's wonderful. So you've thought this out and you have a plan and you've got a 5-year plan, as they say, and you know what you're doing, right?
Yes. When people say, well, even if you're elected president, the president doesn't run things, and the military-industrial complex, what I call the military-industrial corporate congressional media complex, would oppose you because you would basically be obviating, you would be rendering obsolete the existing technical infrastructure that is dependent on fossil fuels, which is a dominant industry and really is the funding source of the powers that be, is the petroleum industry. What I'm saying is if I reach the presidency, I have a card that I can play to literally force this transition, not in a dictatorial way, but in a geopolitical strategic way that will absolutely render any opposition to it impotent. But I don't want to play that card tonight because if I do, I don't think I would physically survive my campaign. But it's not true that the Illuminati, the powers that be, whatever you want to call the global oligarchy, is going to be able to stop this transition, because there is something an American president can do to basically trump them and occupy the field. Just don't want to.
Yeah, if, and that brings up an interesting question. Let's say you're not elected. Could we ever give this technology to a then-seated president and expect them to do what you would be able to do? Would they even understand this? Would they even believe you? I mean, I'm very concerned that if you don't get in office, what's going to happen? Is this going to be kept swept under the rug for the next 200 years? I mean, there's got to be some way that this can get out if you're not elected and taken to the president to be instilled within our Constitution or whatever it takes to bring this out.
I don't need to become president, and in fact, when I reflect on the fact that it was revealed to me in 1980 by my father, and then again in 2000 by Courtney Hunt, who was one of the CIA people on the Jump Room Project. I first met Courtney in 1971 in New Mexico on Project Pegasus, that I would serve in the presidency at some point. I can't say that I necessarily need or want to be president. I just know that it's an historical development that I'm participating in bringing about. But if let's say in 2016 we elect somebody else, if it's a Democrat who's a change agent who will literally stand up to the corporate oligarchy, I can give that president, let's say it's Hillary Clinton or somebody, I can give that president the strategy to literally force this transition, because there is something that a president could do to literally force the current power elite to say, well, we better make this transition or we've basically lost any advantage that we would have. So I just don't want to articulate it now.
Right,
But
yeah, and that's fine. Yeah, because I know that you have some amazing answers, and I know that you can really help this world. You can help the whole planet. I know that. And I really believe that if somebody in your shoes can just get to somebody that's in charge, it'll be an amazing day for all of us. And
something that favors that, let me just mention this. I don't think the public is generally aware, because this is a demographic that's been kept back. But if you assemble a coalition that consists of women, young people, and African Americans, you basically have the plurality you need to become president. I think, in fact, it's almost certain that despite his relative lack of robust popularity, that President Obama will probably be reelected for that reason. There are more Caucasian women with graduate degrees than there are Caucasian men who haven't graduated from high school. We have gone through a demographic transition. The youth vote is huge. It was one of the major components of President Obama's literally exorbitant, his huge popular vote in 2008. He got more votes than any candidate in the history of the Republic. And part of that was the youth vote. Mm-hmm. If you then combine that with the 13% of Americans who are African Americans who strongly adhere to voting a straight Democratic ticket because of what the Democratic Party has done for the African American community as distinguished from the Republicans, we're looking at a situation actually where the Democratic Party may become the new permanent dominant party, and the Republican Party may find itself in the position of the Whigs, where they run out of things to be for or against, and their numbers.
Right.
So I'm confident that if I don't, if I'm not elected president in 2016, that it'll probably be a Democrat, and I hope it's a Democrat that I can work with to try to make this transition, because we are running out of solutions. Every time they build another freeway lane in California, it fills up with cars in 30 days. Now, who among us wants to be driving to work on a 24-lane freeway? But these are the kind of decisions that Caltrans has been making.
Yes. No, I hear you on that one. Boy, I can't wait for the day I can just jump into my Jetsons teleportation device that's in my, garage instead of a car.
Actually, it won't be a device. It'll be in the wall, and you'll set your destination and jump through a portal. Nothing will go with.
Wonderful! I love that. That's great. And it will be physically in 3D in another location, right? I mean, it's so hard for my mind to grasp this. I try, I believe in it, I have the whole thing, but then my thought is, my God, if that was in my living room, I think I'd be deathly afraid to go through it and just turn into a bunch of molecules like on Star Trek.
Well, that's not what happened. In fact, that's the opposite form of teleportation that the American people were shown beginning when Star Trek debuted on American television in 1966. That's quantum teleportation, where you disintegrate the teleportee at the point of embarkation and then reassemble them at the destination.
Correct.
That's practicable because that process would arrest cellular metabolism and kill any biological organism that would be teleported in that manner. So
exactly.
That's not viable commuting. In fact, the kind of teleportation that emerged in 1967-68, utilizing schematics that were left by Nikola Tesla upon his death on January 7th of 1943, involves setting up a field of radiant energy, which is a form of energy that's latent and pervasive in the universe that Tesla discovered. And when the teleportee jumps through that field of energy as it's being broadcast between two elliptical-shaped armatures, a vortal tunnel opens up in time-space, and the person passes through time-space to their destination. So that was actually reduced to practice as to the survival of the teleportee, at the destination uninjured, and being able to set the location in both space and time when I was a child on Project Pegasus in the late 60s and early 70s. So 40 years later, we're going to be able to set it so that you can jump from your living room to your downtown office and literally stride into your office through the wall.
Wow. I can't wait. It's about time. I probably won't be here for that, but I may just come around again for another round if I can get to do that.
Well, like I said, I'm able to, hopefully I'll be cutting that red ribbon at Grand Central Teleport in New York City by 2020. That's the goal.
Well, do you really think it can happen that fast? I mean, that's 8 years, Andrew.
Well, Well, there's a lot of political resistance, but, between now and just 2016, in 2010, the UN reported that we passed through the transition where more than 50% of the people in the world were living in cities. It's now 2012. In 2016, the Social Security Trust Fund will be bankrupt. There'll have been very little additional economic development. Most of the new fortunes will be made in network enterprise. Corporate employment will still be down, etc.
Yes.
So people are going to be clamoring for change. And one of the things they're going to be coping with on a daily basis is the non-commonsensical experience of going out on their local freeway and parking.
Yes.
So there's going to be a demand for a new form of transportation, and I hope to lead that transition.
Well, I think that's amazing. And this brings up something that you and I have never touched upon. What are your political views for, the next few years? Do you think we're going to have a revolution? Do you think the world's going to end in 2012, like a lot of people are saying there's Planet Nibiru out there that's going to cause havoc and we're all going to slip off into another, time slip on the planet, and either we'll come out of it on another dimension, or we're all going to be dead, or we're going to have earthquakes? I mean, what's your whole feel on this? Since you've been to the future, are we all still here in 2016, 2020?
Well, the farthest in time I was sent was 2045, and society had really solved a lot of its problems. What I believe is that we're going through a transition, politically, economically, socially, environmentally, that's as profound as the transition from agricultural employment to industrial employment and urban living in the period, let's say, from 1880 to 1910, 1920. We had a huge wave of immigration from Europe that was primarily urban-based. And so what it is there's a lot of dislocation, there's a lot of stress, and there's a lot of fear. So that when fearful memes are introduced, like the idea that the world might end in 2012 because that's when the Mayan calendar ends, what happens is people become obsessed with a negative view of the future. I don't believe that 2012 represents the end of the world. Rather, I believe it represents the beginning of the future. At the same time, because we're going through a period of transition, it's going to involve more and more political ferment. And we're already seeing that in the different revolutions that are going on around the world, where people are just not putting up with the status quo anymore. In fact,
Correct.
when you listen to people on radio or in the grocery store, there's not necessarily a sense of the need for immediate revolution, but people are voicing their profound discontent nonetheless. I believe that politically, and I was in fact briefed on this by Courtney Hunt, that the pivotal year will be 2015, because basically there'll be a crescendo of popular resentments to government and the corporations that, for example, was pre-shadowed by the Ron Paul candidacy in 2012. People literally clamoring for the end of the Fed and these types of structural, transformative decisions that could be made by a president. So what I'm predicting is profound disquiet and social ferment by 2015 that will embody the movement into government of people who are essentially change agents and not career politicians. They'll be statesmen and women. You know, had the pleasure of meeting Governor Jesse Ventura last October. I filmed a segment of his show Conspiracy Theory.
Great.
And he explained to me, in addition to basically being brilliant every time he spoke with me that day, he said, you know, Andy, I'm what's called a statesman. He goes, you know the difference between a statesman and a politician? I said, what, Governor Ventura? And he said, a statesman goes from where he or she lives and goes to his state or national capital and does the people's business and then goes home. A career politician lives at their state or national capital and finds ways to make money by serving in elective office.
Right.
That's what's going to happen in 2015. There's going to be a demand that a Governor Ventura, a Stephen Greer, and Andrew D. Basiago, and other people who have been challenging fundamental truths in the society, there'll be a popular call for those people to serve in government, not permanently, but just for the transition period that we need to enter to really address successfully our nation's problems, because people are realizing that the career politicians are not doing it.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're failing at the job. I think there may also be a crisis around the issue of whether our elected officials have been receiving covert funding from the U.S. intelligence community. But that's almost more of an intuition that I have. It's just something that I see occurring as a kind of a Watergate of that era. I think that many members of Congress are on the take because, you know, there's a military base in every congressional district.
That's right.
I was told by Courtney Hunt of the CIA that, in fact, our Congress was bought and paid for not just by lobbyists, but by the CIA. And if that was to into a generalized Watergate-type conspiracy, I mean, come on, the next president is going to be an outsider. And that may be me, that may be Governor Ventura, it may be Ralph Nader, it may be Julie Stein of the Green Party with her wonderful green Marshall Plan that she's articulated. But it's going to be a spirited outsider. Yes.
Well, I look forward to that so much. I was just speaking with my father last week on the radio show about the fact that he announced on this radio show, which I'm sure everybody knew, but I didn't know, is that the politicians in Capitol Hill and everywhere else are immune to insider trading. They are allowed to get that information and move on it before anybody else is. And I didn't know that, and I was flabbergasted. Do you know anything about this?
Yes, they're exempt. So if they learn of some sort of favorable situation with a corporation, in the ordinary, let's say, advise and consent exercise of their advise and consent authority in the Senate, they can make a call to their broker and invest in that company, and that's another payola. That is
just mind-boggling to me. And how do they find out about this? Are the lobbyists bringing it to their attention, or do the guys at the CEO at the corporation where they're going to be working at in 20 years call them up and say, "Oh, we bought and paid you. Here you go. Here's your nidbit for the week, or here's your tip." Is that?
The lobbyists are often engaging in information arbitrage where they do just that. They learn about a favorable situation in the corporate sector. And then in order to get their lobbying goals performed through that elected official, they tip them off on a favorable situation, and then the senator or representative then engages in insider trading, so that there's not a quid pro quo deal that's struck, nor a direct transfer of cash to the elected official. There's simply the tipping off about a favorable situation on Wall Street.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Fenton Perspective on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I just wanted to give you a heads up on what Mr. Mad Painter's doing after my show tonight. He's going to have a friend of mine, Doc Marquis. He's an amazing guy. I met him at Conspiracy Con in 2010, and then we connected again at the 2012 Conspiracy Con, and he owes me a back adjustment. So if you're out there, Doc, and you're listening to the show, when you're on with Mad Painter tonight, I'm sure he'll bring that up. So at some point, you're going to have to fly over here and give me a back adjustment. So that would be wonderful. And Mad Painter show's on at 8 o'clock. I'm sorry. It's on 8 o'clock Pacific and 11 p.m. Eastern. Is that correct? Tones? I'm not sure here. Need some help because I don't have the schedule in front of me, but he's on right after me, so
Correct.
Everybody listen in. And there, thank you. And he was raised as a child in the international occult group known as the Illuminati, and he escaped from them. So he has an amazing story to tell you guys, and he will be my guest on September 17th as well. So whatever he does with Mad Painter on today, we'll continue that conversation on September 17th on my 5 p.m. show. So there you go. Okay, back to Andrew, and then we're going to have my friend Brian, who's my business partner for UFO Con at 6:45 today, which is 9:40. Is it 9:45 Eastern? Yes, and he'll be talking about UFO Con, and Andrew's going to talk a little bit about what he's going to do at UFO Con, also within a short minute of time. So, and here we go, bringing Andrew back on here.
Hi, Lorian.
Hi. Okay, where were we?
Well, we got into some political depth there, but perhaps we can go back and discuss my presentation at UFOCon 2012 on September 15th and 16th, and that is actually something quite remarkable has happened, and that is that there were a few disparate individuals who had come forward regarding their experiences taking the jump room to Mars. And in order of public emergence, they were Michael Relf, and then myself, and then Arthur Neumann, who was the Henry Deacon informant of Bill Ryan and Kerry Cassidy at Project Camelot.
Right.
But I really ended up having something happen that was my goal the whole time. Well, for the entire existence of my Truth campaign, which began in 2004 when I began publicly lecturing about my experiences in Project Pegasus. And that is that my fellow teleportees would come forward. Well, after I appeared on Coast to Coast AM the second time, no, actually it was the first time in November 11th of 2009, I was contacted on April 23rd of 2010 by William B. Stillings, who was an individual who was both trained with me, and we were present on the surface several times after taking the jump room. And then after we appeared with Laura Eisenhower on November 10th of 2011, Bernard Mendez stepped forward with his rich background as Richard Nixon's principal liaison to extraterrestrials, and essentially the individual who not only served as one of the jumpers in the CIA's Mars jump room program, but investigated it for the federal government. And so we have three jumpers who knew each other back in the day and jumped together. And that's something that actually I think is unprecedented in the literature of non-ordinary experience. It would be, for example, let's say the two brothers and their two friends who were in the Allagash, Maine alien abduction case. Suppose they didn't know each other after 30 years. Yeah. And then one of them went on the radio, and they all found themselves together. That's actually what happened. I haven't spent the last 30 years in communication with Brett Stillings and with Benny Mendez, but now we're in frequent communication as individuals who were trained together, who know different aspects of the jump room program, and who serve together literally, physically, in the program. And so I'll be going into the backstory of that during my presentation on September 15th.
Oh, wonderful. That's going to be an amazing presentation. I can't wait because Alfred's going to be there as well, and he's got some interesting twists on all this, from what I understand. And he was on my show last week, and, we didn't talk a whole lot about UFO because obviously we want everybody to show up there and hear what they have to say at the event, which would be lovely, and meet you guys. I mean, we're putting you guys in a room also all together in the speakers area, and anybody who wants to come on down, I haven't said this on the radio yet, but I'm going to announce it today. You don't have to pay for a ticket to get into the vendors room. And we have a space in there where all the speakers are at, so if you wanted to just come down and meet the speakers, you're more than welcome to. We try to keep this open on some level so that people can actually have access to you guys. And that, if somebody has been part of this program that maybe has been afraid before to connect with you or whatever, I urge you, if you live on the West Coast and you can get to Santa Clara, California, come on down and introduce yourself again to Andrew or Alfred or Laura or Bernie or whoever else you may have been involved with during the program. And even if it was a fringe program or somebody else, that you were dealing with within the program, I'm sure Andrew, or between the four of them, they know who that person was. So you just have to mention their name and they would know. And they'd love to meet you. So I encourage anybody else who's been part of these programs, please come down. You don't have to buy a ticket. Just come on into the hotel, go to the vendor room, go to the speakers tables, and somebody will be there off and on during the day. So just hang out and have a good time and, come forth. Because if there's more of you, Andrew, I'm sure would love to meet you. Is that correct, Andrew?
Yes, I've been operating my Truth Campaign from its initiation in 2000. I was essentially investigating what I had experienced, and then I began lecturing in 2004 from the perspective that the best possible outcome is for those who are involved to come forward so that my claims don't stand in isolation. And I've also applied the principle that I don't have the final dispositive truth of what happened. I'm just being truthful. So when I speak of a Truth Campaign, I'm talking about an operating principle that I'm devoted to, not that I'm always speaking with dispositive proof as if I possess some omniscience or omnipotence. So, for example, when Bernard Mendez came along and qualified the possible domain that the jump rooms were accessing, I not only encouraged him to share that information, but I created opportunities for him at the level of public appearances and media appearances so that he could share his truth about what we experienced and what he experienced.
Exactly, and it was you that told me about Bernie and asked me to get him on my radio show, and he was my first guest ever on my show. So I thank you for that, because without you, I would never have known about him, So it's wonderful that you're promoting him.
Well, at least in terms of creating a democratic discourse, because after all, we're all born at a different location in time-space. Even twins are, right? Usually one twin comes out of the womb before the other. And even if they're birthed at the same time, they're literally in a different location in time-space because they're next to each other, right?
Exactly.
Even Siamese twins, even conjoined twins are perceiving a different slice of the quantum hologram, a different view of reality. So since we're never even occupying fully together the same event, with the passage of 30 years, 40 years, we have to be respectful of the discontinuities that exist between other people's understandings of what reality consists of, because we were occupying different universes when we shared events with each other.
Right.
And so I'm calling for a sort of a tolerance principle of, look, suspend judgment and say, what are these people saying? Let this individual speak so we understand what they believe happened to them, and then let's start finding the continuities and the discontinuities in their separate accounts to try to determine what has really happened in our world. Because look, after the Manhattan Project, the U.S. government was secretly spending trillions of dollars on defense technical projects. Is it that unbelievable that time travel was achieved by 1970, that one of the time travel technologies was being used to reach Mars by 1980, that NASA may be lying when it says the atmospheric pressure on Mars is only 8 millibar? I mean,
Yeah, which reminds me, have you've seen the new Curiosity pictures, the blue sky? I'm just whoa! I completely looked at that and was amazed,
well,
absolutely amazed.
one of the first challenges to my account of being on Mars was the claim of scientifically oriented people who were telling me there wasn't enough oxygen on Mars to breathe. And I said, if there wasn't enough oxygen, how could there be blue skies there? And that's a matter of public record. And then some of the leading
Right.
anomalists, Paul Goodwin of Mars Uncensored, Andrew R. Steck of MarsRevealed.com, and now the individuals that I'm working with, Ross Curley of my organization, Mars, Neville Thompson of my organization, and myself as a Mars researcher, we've published the evidence of the fact that the planet Mars has a blue sky. So it's a matter of public record that I stated that the sky of the Mars I visited was blue, and I did so at a time when the scientific position on that was that Mars couldn't have a blue sky because it didn't have enough oxygen. Oxygen, of course, is a clear gas which refracts blue, and that's why our
Correct.
own skies on Earth are blue, because our atmosphere is about 21% oxygen. So we were breathing with difficulty on Mars, or whatever domain they were sending us to, but we were breathing. We were surviving. I remember one time when I walked in a lot with Courtney and with Brett, my thigh muscles were just screaming with hypoxia. So that it was a diminished amount of oxygen, but it was the kind of oxygen supply you might encounter, let's say, at about 14,000 feet. So some of the symptoms we were exhibiting would be the kinds of hypoxia that, let's say, mountaineers at high altitudes experience. But it did have oxygen. We were breathing on the surface without assistance. In fact, I dispensed with my respiration gear on the first jump in July of 1981. So yes, Mars has blue skies, it has oxygen, and if its atmospheric pressure was only 8 millibar, as NASA has claimed, that wouldn't be a sufficient cushion of air to allow parachute deployment of the
Exactly.
exploration rovers, Spirit, Opportunity, and Curiosity to the surface. So we know
Exactly.
it's
Yeah,
probably
yeah. I'm sure you were watching that whole thing with rapt attention, weren't you?
Well, I mean, we can't rely on self-appointed scientific authorities when they say things to us that are absurd. They were saying, we are dropping this satellite into the Martian atmosphere, the parachute is deploying, and we are slowly depositing this probe onto the surface of Mars, and Mars has an atmospheric pressure of 8 millibar. I mean, at that atmospheric pressure, Brett Stillings did an estimate that the parachute would have to be as large. This is what I love about working with my beloved colleagues and friends in this area right now, this history. The parachute, Brett determined, I think quite brilliantly, would have to be the size of the continental United States.
I love it.
Rover Spirit on the surface of a Mars with an atmospheric pressure of 8 millibar.
Okay, so that's just, yeah.
Larry.
It's so far-fetched, the things that they're telling us, I can't even believe it. Well, Andrew, I hate to do this because I'm finding that this is just so fascinating. We could go on for another 2 hours, I'm sure. But Brian's on the phone, and I'd like to bring in and introduce my good friend and business partner, Brian William Hall from UFO Con, and he's going to say hello to you, Andrew, and the two of you can banter for a second about what's going to happen at UFO Con if you'd like to, and then Brian's going to take it away and talk about what we're up to. So hi, Brian, are you there?
Hi, Lorian. Hi, Andrew. I am here. Great to be on the show.
Thank you. It's great having you here. So anyhow, Andrew's just wrapping up. Anything you want to say about our illustrious Mars time-traveling friend here?
Well, you know, Andrew, this is the first time we've actually met, but I've heard a lot about you, and it's one of the reasons why we decided to bring you on board our flag event, the first annual UFO Con coming up next month, September 15th and 16th. You will literally be at our conference, with very little exception, the face on Mars. And I just caught the end of the interview where you were talking about the recent lander. What is it, Curiosity?
Curiosity, yes.
Yeah, and no, the established science, establishment science, and establishment geopolitics, they are not going to tell us what really is going on with our nearest neighbors, the Moon and Mars. There's some extraordinary things going on. I'm convinced, Andrew, that there is indeed a secret space program and perhaps a lot of other exotic programs utilizing technologies that the powers that be will not share with any of us. A lot of people talk about, oh, when will disclosure occur? Well, you have to remember, folks, that we are slaves. At least we are in the jaundiced eyes of our so-called masters up on high on this pyramid planet. They are not going to share the secret government, if you will. And first of all, you cannot have a fundamental understanding of Earth history or current global geopolitics until you acknowledge the existence and influence therein of that which is colloquially known as the shadow government. The shadow government, these forces have been around for a long time, and they have access to amazing technologies. Technologically, we live in a three-tiered society. There's the garbage we as citizens have access to. Then there's the stuff the military has, which won't be announced for, 15 to 50 years. Then there's the really interesting stuff in the hands of the secret space program, black ops programs, very, very highly sophisticated aerospace technologies and aircraft, and beyond. And the powers that be, they're not going to share any of these technologies with their so-called slaves. Why would they lift a finger to set us free? They are going to continue to use this technology to expand their operations both on this world and off. And Andrew, I'm really glad you're on board to be a part of telling at least a part of that equation, sharing with us that which we are not being told. So I'm excited to finally meet you and see your presentation, and of course everybody else will be with us next month.
Wonderful. Well, hey Andrew, thank you so much for being with us, and I'll see you very soon, okay?
Okay, it'll be a pleasure to be there at UFOCon 2012, and of course Bernard Mendez, one of my jump room colleagues, is going to be there as a special guest, so those attending will have an opportunity to meet both of us and ask us direct questions
exactly.
about and establish the existence of the U.S. secret space program, not through some sort of official government announcement that will never come, but disclosure through the personal accounts of those who have served in secret projects and are now coming forward.
Yeah, disclosure will occur from that standpoint, Andrew. You're right. From the good people who are whistleblowing and talking about these things and really painting a bigger picture. A lot of the testimony, though, comes from people who were in compartmentalized positions. The left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. And people erroneously in the UFO community assume that if something in the sky defies Newtonian physics, it's ET phoning home. No, there's a very good possibility that most of the time it's what we're up to. And I think that's one of the biggest secrets, bigger than even extraterrestrials themselves.
Oh, I totally agree, Brian, and I so look forward to meeting you and participating on September 15th and 16th.
Awesome, Andrew. Thanks again for being a part of next month.
You've got it, my friend.
And Andrew, thank you for being here today, and I'll talk to you very soon, okay?
That sounds great. I look forward. Take care, Lauren.
You bet. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Brian, hello, dear.
Yes,
Okay.
I am here.